So the informal economy is usually defined as those activities that have market value but are not formally registered. But it also includes activities by registered firms that are concealed from authorities.
And the informal economy is truly a global phenomenon. According to the ILO, about 2 billion workers, or 60% of the working age population, operates in the informal sector. My name is Corinne Deléchat. I'm a division chief in the African department and mission chief for Senegal.
And my name is Leandro Medina. I'm originally from Argentina, and I currently work as a senior economist at the Strategy, Policy and Review Department.
Welcome to this podcast produced by the International Monetary Fund. In this program, a new book that brings together research by the IMF looks at the causes and effects of the high levels of informality in economies across the globe. Leandro Medina and Corinne Deléchat are co-editors of the book titled The Global Informal Workforce, Priorities for Inclusive Growth. So is it mainly a developing country thing, the informal economy, or are there informal sectors in advanced economies as well?
So the informal economy tends to be larger in lower income countries and to decline as countries develop, but it's still a significant part of advanced economies. On average, informal sector represents 35% of GDP in low and middle income countries, but that can have very wide variation. It can go from like 30% of output in Chile to over 90% in Senegal. In advanced economies, it still represents about 15% of GDP.
And Leandro, given these businesses work so hard to stay basically under the radar, how do you measure something that is essentially off the books?
So it is indeed very difficult to measure the informal economy, as activities within it cannot be directly observed. And usually the informal economy participants do not want to be accounted for. So different methodologies have been used over the years. They are usually either direct or indirect methodologies. The direct methodologies are basically surveys or different questionnaires that have been used, but it's extremely difficult because not always people are truthful about what they do and how they do it. There's also indirect methods that have to do with looking for a proxy that gives you an idea of the size of the economy. And the most popular have to do with looking at the electricity consumption within an area, or looking at the cash in excess in an economy that can give you an idea of the size of the informal economy. Also, one can think of more like macro models, where basically you treat the informal economy as an unobserved component in a model where you have both causes and indicators, and that would give you an idea of, or you estimate the unobserved component, and it gives you an idea. Also recently, the technology has allowed to use those night lights perceived by satellite, and this information has been used as also as a proxy of the size of the economy.
Yeah, and that brings up data. I think a lot of these countries, especially developing countries, is always an issue finding the data for research like this. Corinne, did you have trouble finding the data that you needed to determine, the breadth of the informal economies?
So we use basically two main data sources. One is a comprehensive and broad survey done by the ILO of informal workers and firms. Their latest report is a 2018 report called Women and Men in the Informal Economy, which covers about 180 countries. And the other one is a method that Leo here used very successfully called the MIMIC method, which is basically a composite of indicators to look at the size of the informal economy. So on the one hand, we had measure on numbers of workers in the informal economy, and then the measure developed by Leo and colleagues measured the share of the total output that is informal. The two measures are quite correlated, but because the productivity of informal workers tends to be low, the slope is relatively flat. So a country with 70% informal workers can have an informal economy that is only 30 or 40% of output.
So are countries with large informal sectors necessarily less productive?
This is mostly the case as found by research. And the reason is because informal workers and firms are mostly small production units and tend to remain small. Remember that in low-income countries, 85% of informal workers tend to be in precarious employment. It's not really a choice. They end up in the informal sector because there's no opportunities in the formal sector, or they're excluded from the formal sector because they're too poor or uneducated. So all these activities like the street vendors and the market sellers tend to remain with low productivity. So overall, countries with a very large informal sector tends to grow below its potential.
Maybe also just to complement Corinne, research has found that in sub-Saharan Africa, on average, the productivity of small informal firms, it's only 25% of the productivity of formal firms. So it's only 25%. And this difference likely reflects a combination of lower skill levels among workers and also lower level of physical capital.
So did your research find anything that indicates that perhaps technology is pushing even more people underground? I mean, with higher demand for higher skilled workers, especially in advanced economies, are those people without the skills moving into the informal sector?
Not in our research, we find actually the opposite, that basically the technology has actually helped previously, for example, fintech, right? And all the developments in the financial technology that has allowed to people that were previously unbanked to now have access to electronic accounts through their own cell phones, right? So what we find is actually that the financial technology has actually increased inclusion, not exclusion, from the formal sector.
Yeah, so another result of our research and what is mentioned in the book is that the COVID pandemic has forced governments to innovate and then to reach out to informal workers, because informal workers have been the most affected by the lockdowns, since the informal economy is essentially all composed mostly of activities that involve contact. Again, the sellers, the domestic workers, activities that cannot be performed at home. So the impact of the lockdowns has been absolutely devastating on these sectors and these people. And governments had to get really creative to reach out to them and extend cash transfers and benefits, since these people don't benefit from unemployment insurance and then social protection. So they developed mobile cash transfers to provide people with a lifeline. A good example is Togo, where they set up a system based on voter registration that was targeting informal workers. They could register with their mobile phones, and they got a deposit in their account. And then that scheme was really successful to help support informal workers such as scooter or minibus drivers. And then they had a special additional benefit for women as well.
So would you say that this dependence on informal jobs, especially in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, is actually prolonging the COVID-19 crisis in the region?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think there's various factors involved in the dissemination of the pandemic, and then counteracting factors are the fact that the population in sub-Saharan Africa is extremely young, that a lot of these activities occur outside, so these mitigates the transmission. All we're trying to say is that we have to be aware that the informal workers are the ones that have been the most affected, and they need support from government. In countries where the mobile cash transfers were successful, this can be the beginning of an infrastructure to expand social safety nets and to make the economy more resilient for the next crisis.
And you also look closely in the book at the gender aspect of informality. Where do women fit into this story?
So globally, there are more men than women in the informal economy, but in lower and middle income countries, it's the other way around. In 2 out of 3 low income countries, there's more women in the informal sector. And women are also in the most precarious forms of informal employment. For example, women represent about 80% of domestic workers globally, and then these activities are extremely precarious. There's absolutely no protection and no possibilities to take paid leave or do the work remotely. So informality and gender inequality go hand in hand, as is discussed in one of the chapters in the book.
And so, how do you reduce the book is all about trying to find solutions, trying to find ways of reducing the size of the informal sector. But how do you do that without, taking away critical sources of income for, these millions, billions of people who depend on these jobs to survive?
Exactly. So how to deal with the informality is ultimately linked to its definition, right? And what you were saying about how the informality matters also because in the absence of opportunities in the formal sector, people working in the informal sector could be completely out of resources. It could be bound to poverty. So the informal economy actually acts as a safety net. So any policy should take into account this dimension. So the key policies to basically enforce formalization have to do with, of course, increased access and quality of education. They have to do with financial inclusion, product market reforms, labor market reforms, and of course, institutions. The institutions really matter. Even in advanced countries, the countries with better institutions usually have a lower informality. And that's what we find also in our research.
And so what do you think the role is of the international community to sort of, try and have countries within these regions implement some of these policies that you're suggesting?
Well, there's institutions that have a direct mandate to facilitate the transition towards a more formal and more decent job, which is the ILO, the International Labour Organization. And that's why we are partnering with the ILO in launching the book, recognizing their specific role. The IMF does its part, again, because informality is related to issues that are macro critical and then critical to the IMF mandate, thinking of growth, poverty, inequality, and gender inequality. So we're providing advice to countries, especially in the context of the recovery, to implement inclusive policies that would address informality and inequality at the same time, to ensure that we don't have a divergent recovery with advanced economy growing faster and low-income countries falling further and further behind. We do this through our policy advice to countries. We do this through our lending programs. I'm thinking about the IMF strategy on engagement in social spending, which is a big part of that, supporting greater spending on health and education, social protection. We have floors on social spending in most of our programs with low-income countries, for example. And in recent programs, such as Madagascar, there's also specific program targets linked to the expansion of cash transfers or social safety nets to more beneficiaries. The final angle is the capacity development and the training, where we support the design of more redistributive fiscal policies, the composition of spending, prioritizing social spending and structural policies on education, labor market, and then a big component on financial inclusion. And finally, something that's become more important in our training is the gender responsive policies and gender budgeting to address the gender aspect.
Corinne Deléchat and Leandro Medina, both economists at the IMF. Congratulations on this book on the global informal workforce, and thanks for sharing this invaluable research with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Corinne Deléchat and Leandro Medina are co-editors of the Global Informal Workforce, Priorities for Inclusive Growth. Check it out at the IMF bookstore, that's imf.bookstore.org, or at the IMF's e-library, that's e-library, one word, .imf.org. And look for other IMF podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.